Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the AME Food Testing Show. Today's topic is with Cathy Crawford, a vice president in the HACCP Consulting Group out of Fairfax, Virginia. She will be talking on how a food production facility designs a HACCP plan. Just to let you know a little bit about Cathy, she joined the HACCP Consulting Group 10 years after working for a privately owned meat and poultry company where she was responsible for regulatory compliance, developing food safety strategies, ensuring appropriate export programs, and coordinating the recall system. She has a bachelor's degree in biology from Arizona State University and a master's degree in food safety from Michigan State University. She also has a certificate in international food law from the International Institute for Food Laws and Regulations at Michigan State. She's a registered auditor for safe quality foods. She was an instructor for a series of food dispense workshops sponsored by the USDA Food Safety Inspection Service. She also facilitated national focus group meetings, bringing together industry, trade association, and FSIS representatives to produce new model voluntary food defense plans and FSIS guidance material. Cathy has provided HACCP and other food safety training to a wide variety of businesses, including meat and poultry processors, bakeries, confectionery companies, produce companies, and food service establishments. She also provided training for the veterinary food safety inspectors in Poland in 2011 regarding U.S. food regulations, including HACCP. I now introduce Cathy Crawford. Cathy?
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Wow, what's a wonderful introduction. Can you add anything of your qualifications to the group?
Well, I've had a lot of experience in HACCP, and it's most valuable when you get out from a single company and see the variety of ways that the HACCP philosophy can be used. I thought after 10 years working in the meat and poultry industry that I knew HACCP, and I had a good grip on the concepts, but when you get out and see other industries, other types of foods, other types of operations, you really see how useful a consistent philosophy can be in managing food safety. It's been a wonderful adventure.
Great. Can you briefly tell our audience what the acronym HACCP means, and then kind of analyze how that concept analyzes the properties of each food product line?
Of course. HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point. It's a 12-step process that includes 7 principles. And without getting tangled up in those numbers and the technicalities of it, the fundamental concept of HACCP is that you look at what you make, analyze it for the risks that are involved, and put together a logical plan on how to control those risks. When you analyze a food product line or a food in particular, the important thing is to focus on food safety and describe that product or process as well as how that product is going to be used by the end user. A mistake I often see when people are developing HACCP plans is that they describe the product in terms of quality parameters. It tastes great. It looks wonderful. This is not what we're looking for. We're looking for food safety characteristics like pH or moisture or water activity or the type of packaging used, because those factors impact food safety. When you analyze your products and processes, you can categorize them into groups, and based on risk, you can determine the number of HACCP plans that you might need for one particular facility.
That's an interesting concept, the number of HACCP plans. When we generally talk to food safety officers, they consider their organization to have one HACCP plan. Can you illuminate that?
Absolutely. I've seen companies that have not enough and companies that have too many plans. If you have 2 products that are very different in nature based on their hazards, not on their quality characteristics, but based on their potential hazards, then they should have two separate HACCP plans. A classic example would be a company that produces fully cooked items but also sells raw items. Those are two different HACCP plans because they are such different foods. On the other hand, if you make 6 different varieties of a cooked item and they're all very similar with slight changes perhaps in flavor, they all belong under a single HACCP plan.
Very good. So the crafting of a process flow diagram or a chart of materials for a facility would be important.
That would be the next step. After you describe your product or your process and its intended use by the consumer, you create a diagram of the process in your facility, how product or food moves from place to place, and what you do to change that product along the way. It's important that it's a simple diagram so that it's clear, but it has to be accurate. It can't just be done in an office. You can sketch it out in an office, but after you do that, you really have to go out into the processing environment or the kitchen and watch to see where food goes and make sure this drawing that you've created is accurate. The things that people often forget to include in these flow diagrams is that product doesn't always go one way. We know we purchase things, we put it in storage, and then we use it in some way in our process. And the flow diagram usually has those 3 steps in it. What we often forget is that when we take things out of storage, sometimes we don't use it all and we put some back. So the arrow between those 2 boxes on a flow chart should go both directions to reflect true life and what's going on in your process. The other thing people often forget is that your company might accept returned product, and this should be reflected in your process. And you also might have what we call rework, which could be something that you reprocess for some reason because it had perhaps quality issues that had to be redone. Or rework could be product that is carried over from one day to the next. All these details should be reflected in a flow chart that is still somewhat simple. And I know that sounds like a contradiction, but the goal is to accurately describe your process so that we can continue the HACCP philosophy of understanding first what you do and then evaluating the hazards.
Excellent advice. It really focuses in on the general drafting of the diagram and then allowing for the specifics of the actual practice. Can you give us a little more hints that you've had in your training on flow diagrams or charting?
Well, an important factor is to make sure it makes sense to you. Don't overcomplicate it by trying to use words that aren't familiar. If you were to describe your process to me in 10 sentences, turn each of those steps into a box on your flow chart. If I said, what do you do for a living at your facility? And you say, well, we buy product, we store it, then we might chop it, then we might blend it, then we might cook it. It's those simple phrases that become the boxes on your flow chart. So start there. And then when you've got that, you go out in your plant and you add the detail that you feel necessary to make sure that it's an accurate picture of what you do. It's also important to remember byproducts. If there is something that is trimmed away or something that you would consider a byproduct or a leftover product from your process that perhaps you sell to someone as maybe a feed item or as a product that can be further processed somewhere else, you need to include that in your flow chart and your description of what you do at your facility. Sometimes companies that make finished product forget about their byproducts, and those need to be included in your HACCP plan. Excellent.
The next issue that we'd like to discuss is how to perform a risk analysis.
Boy, that's the toughest part. When you think of the HACCP philosophy, the entire goal of what we're doing is to understand and control risk. So the risk analysis is key to this process. In a nutshell, what you do is sit down and brainstorm with your food safety team, and hopefully that team is cross-functional, meaning you've got someone who understands perhaps microbiology, someone from quality assurance, maybe someone even from sales or maintenance, and someone from production. You need a variety of people in this meeting who sit down and look at the steps in your process based on that flow chart that you created. And for each step, you sit and discuss what could go wrong. And you look at biological hazards, such as bacteria, yeast, mold, viruses, chemical hazards, such as allergens or chemicals that aren't properly used, or perhaps antibiotics that are at the wrong concentration in your raw material. And you also look at potential physical hazards, such as the potential for glass or metal or wood. And for each step, you write down what could happen. That's the brainstorming part. The next step is to evaluate those risks and say, how serious are they? You have to look at the severity of how this could impact a consumer, and you also have to look at the likelihood that something may or may not occur in your process. It's through this risk analysis that you help look at everything that could go wrong and narrow it down to what might be essential for you to control and how it can be controlled. It's important in working with a HACCP plan that you already have other food safety programs in place, such as a strong sanitation program or a pest control program or an allergen control program, because the presence of these programs and the efficiency that they are managed and how well they're implemented helps determine your decisions in this risk analysis process.
Excellent information. I particularly like your analysis of potential hazards in the Food Safety Committee. Can you bring up any interesting things that you've learned in your training that particularly refine this group's work?
Every HACCP plan is a little bit different. I have sat down with companies and started this process of a hazard analysis, and I'd say, okay, let's talk about the beginning, at receiving. What are the potential hazards? And they'd say, we can't think of any. This is not a good answer. We need to try harder than that. If you're having trouble thinking of answers to these questions, read the news, look at recalls that have happened, and try and think about the causes for them and how that might impact your business. That's a great way to approach HACCP. Just look around you and what has impacted other companies. Another approach is to take a HACCP course so that you can learn more about the potential hazards, biological, chemical, and physical, and look at those as part of your analysis. Every plan is very different. In some cases, the quality of the water coming into the facility can be a key concern to talk about in your risk analysis. In other situations, it may be an equipment issue or a raw material issue. It varies. This is why it's essential that every HACCP plan is unique. You can't just buy one off the shelf. It has to be supported and reflective of your own system and your own decisions.
Well, Cathy, you bring a wealth of knowledge and training to this question of HACCP plans. In your experience, do food safety auditors or inspectors review the HACCP plan in the course of their inspections or audits?
Oh, well, if they don't, they absolutely should. I can tell you I certainly do. I audit for safe quality foods, and if you just look at the title of that particular scheme or code, Safe Quality Foods is a HACCP-based program. It is essential. It's the core of what we're doing because HACCP summarizes your food safety efforts and defines how you're controlling the most important aspects of those efforts. Reviewing a HACCP plan takes a lot of time. So as an auditor, if for some reason you only have one day to audit a facility, you may review the written HACCP plan, but then using that plan, you can focus in on what's critical based on decisions the plant made, and then focus in the right areas to make sure the plant is addressing those critical areas.
Excellent. The next subject we'd like to address is establishing critical limits through scientific methods and documentation. Your lead-in really kind of eased us into the whole question of documentation, particularly presenting to an auditor.
Well, in doing your risk analysis, it's important you write down all your decisions and clearly communicate them as if a stranger is going to read them. Unfortunately, in our business, the consumers, the world, does not trust you if you manufacture a food. It's up to you that you can prove that you can do it safely. So documentation is critical. When you get your risk analysis written out and you look at all these hazards that could take place, you have to then narrow them down to decide which ones are critical. And you do this by deciding which step in your process can prevent, eliminate, or reduce a food safety hazard that is reasonably likely to occur and is significant or severe enough that it must be addressed. There's a lot of words in what I just said, but fundamentally you sit down and look at your flow chart and all the hazards you discussed and decide through a scientific or logical process which step or which steps are critical. I can't emphasize strongly enough how important this decision is. I've seen companies assign too many critical control points in a plan to the point where they are not really focused. They're looking at everything as critical. And I've seen companies that don't assign enough because they missed something that truly is important. The bottom line question as a critical control point to decide if a point in your process is critical or not is, if I do this step incorrectly, could the customer get hurt? If that's reasonably likely to be true, then there's a good chance that is a critical control point, and you have to incorporate into your HACCP plan how you will manage that point to make sure every time you will do that step correctly.
Well, Cathy, your advice certainly focuses on protocols and procedures. What are some of the scientific methods that a food safety officer can incorporate as far as testing to validate whether or not they're on course?
Validation is a very hot topic. It's one of the toughest things to do in a thorough manner, and it's a very difficult topic to understand. People sometimes confuse verification with validation. Verification is proving that you are doing what you promised to do. Validation is proving that it works and that the plan was a good plan in the first place. So validation often requires data, strong data, to prove that your program is functioning the way you intended it to function. And it can be a wide variety of things. Some companies use finished product testing. This can be an effective tool, but you have to remember that testing, particularly microbiological testing, takes time. If you need to know answers quickly, this is not always the best answer, although it is excellent supporting material to use for any HACCP plan to prove, for example, that your finished product doesn't contain pathogens. Product testing is a great tool for that. Other methods to validate your plan include collecting data to prove over a period of time that a process is stable and it's meeting critical limits that you defined in your plan. For example, every time you cook something, does it reach 165 degrees Fahrenheit? If you summarize this data over time and demonstrate that the process is stable and under control, then you're collecting the data you need to validate your program.
Excellent advice. I've had several clients that have produced a product the same way for many years, and for some reason, a pathogen shows up in their product in a far-off location. Then they're inspected by government inspectors, and their entire program is reviewed. Can you give any advice about how this sort of validation will act as a protection for that sort of occurrence?
Absolutely. A lot of things can go wrong once you ship your product and it's no longer under your control. And when things do go wrong, the investigation often goes back rightfully to the manufacturer so that you can show that when it was shipped, it was appropriately made under food safety and quality controls. The test results help prove that. If you don't have that documentation, you can have a significant challenge proving perhaps that a contamination event happened after you shipped the product rather than when it was under your control. It's one thing you said reminded me of the importance that a HACCP plan needs to be a living document. HACCP plans are not just things, it's a process. You should continually be reevaluating what you're doing based on what you learn. So if you hear of a product similar to yours that had a positive result for a pathogen out in the marketplace, even if it was not your product, you should reevaluate your own plan and look at your records and reassess to make sure your decisions regarding food safety are still strong decisions.
Excellent advice. As a matter of fact, that was going to be my next question. How often would a food safety committee review their periodic HACCP plan?
Well, in some cases by law, it's mandatory that you review it at least once a year. Under the Global Food Safety Initiative system, which is a third-party audit system that is being required by most major retailers, you also have to review it at least once per year. But you should review it anytime there is a significant change in a food safety risk. And that could be a change that you heard about on the outside world, meaning the news, or it could be an internal change, like you added another shift, or you added new equipment, or you added new ingredients. Anytime there's a change, you should sit down and discuss it and document a reassessment. Currently, there's no regulation or industry guidance regarding the way a reassessment should be documented. The important thing is that you do it. It can be as simple as taking minutes during a meeting where you discuss this factor, or it could be more complex where you take time to collect data and support a particular concern regarding a HACCP reassessment. It all depends on the significance or seriousness of the risk that you're discussing.
Excellent, Cathy. I have a question. If you are called in as a consultant to review an existing HACCP plan, can you walk us through the steps that you would follow with your food safety officer in that facility?
Sure. Very often I start with a written document because I want to understand what they're communicating on paper first before I go in and see the plant, and then I can see that the two correlate well. But I follow the Codex 12 Steps of HACCP, which are some of the things we've talked about today without detailing them by number. But I'm sure that the company who has concerns has set up a HACCP plan following Codex guidelines and the 7 principles of HACCP, or 12 steps. In the documentation, I make sure that it's thorough, that in their hazard analysis they didn't just put together a plan without really thinking about it. For example, I always look to see that manufacturers address allergens. In the last 2 to 3 years, there have been more and more allergen-related recalls. And in some food sectors, when you look at recalls over a period of time, there are more recalls caused by undeclared allergens than there are by pathogens. So you can see the importance of noticing that and documenting that in your HACCP plan. So I always look for that. Once I go through the documentation and see what they promised they were going to do, I go into the plant and look at their records and watch what they're doing to make sure it matches. A HACCP plan isn't worth a whole lot when it's just a piece of paper. True HACCP happens on the floor, in the production plant, or in the kitchen, where you see employees who are trained, understand what they're doing, and know how to monitor and control those points that the company said was critical. I will look at records, particularly for the critical control points, and make sure that there were not any deviations. A deviation is a word that we use for when a company fails to meet the standards that they set up in their HACCP plan for a critical control point. For example, you might look through records and find that the cooking temperature one day was only 160 instead of 165. If the company failed to notice that and act on it, that's a significant problem because it has been declared as a critical control point. So those are the things I look for. It's not very often that I find critical errors. I usually find more subtle errors, and I assist companies in improving their record keeping so that someday, if they are challenged, they can support their HACCP program with strong data.
That's excellent advice, Cathy. Can you relate, without any specific names or experiences, what are some of the more obvious challenges that you've seen for food producers in their HACCP programs?
Unfortunately, there's a difference between the HACCP philosophy on its own and real life, I have to admit. There are pressures that companies face that are sometimes inconsistent with the HACCP philosophy. Under the HACCP philosophy, you evaluate your plan and you make decisions based on science and data about what is or isn't a hazard and what is or isn't a critical control point. Unfortunately, we run into situations where customers will mandate a critical control point. And so companies put it in place, even though they have data to show something isn't a hazard, they'll treat it as if it is one because their customer asked them to. Occasionally, we run into the same situation with government inspectors, where a local government inspector is convinced something should be a critical control point and the company disagrees, and the company will implement that point in order to basically stay in compliance and not have difficulties with their inspectors. So there are times when there's a conflict with a true scientific approach to HACCP and one that will keep your customers and your regulators also appeased or recognizing that you're in compliance. It requires flexibility. It's just the way that we have to run our business nowadays. Most often, HACCP is logical and effective. I've never seen a company that has, in good faith, implemented a HACCP plan where they struggle to control food safety. If you incorporate HACCP and follow its principles, you have a strong grip on maintaining control in your plant.
You know, Cathy, your recommendations and experiences really bring out something that I've experienced recently, and that's that more and more customers are entering with more frequency into the actual food production facility and inspecting on their own. Their buyers are actually walking through the plant. Do you find that a solid HACCP plan brings more comfort to those enlightened buyers?
Oh, absolutely. HACCP is one of those key phrases that when you say it, it just adds confidence. There are many companies out there that say, we are HACCP certified. I'm not sure what that means. It may mean different things to different people, but just using the word HACCP adds confidence because what it tells your customer is that you followed a logical approach. And it's an approach that isn't just popular, it's required and it's accepted, not just even in the United States, but internationally. Everywhere we have found for well over 50 years that this system works. It truly adds confidence when clients walk through to show them this is part of our HACCP plan, this is a critical control point, this is how we manage it, here's our records. That ability to discuss food safety risks in a logical manner to show that you have a strong system really does great things for customer confidence. And then they can pass that on through with their marketing systems to the consumers to say that we buy products from a certain company and that company has a HACCP plan. It makes a difference. HACCP
Very
plans,
good. Well, Cathy?
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to also mention that HACCP plans may become mandatory in the future because of the Food Safety Modernization Act. So anyone
Yes.
who will,
Can you elaborate on that?
Any company that prepares, packs, or handles food may have to develop a HACCP plan in the near future. The law itself is not calling it HACCP. It's not using those words. But the initial impressions we're getting regarding the law that is going to be written, it's not published yet, is that it will follow these same principles.
Well, Cathy, that leads into our final point. What are the services offered by the HACCP Consulting Group?
HACCP Consulting Group has 10 members right now, and we're in various areas in the U.S., plus one member who lives in Mexico. And we offer consulting to firms who wish to develop or fine-tune their food safety programs. We offer HACCP courses that are accredited through the International HACCP Alliance. We help companies with import and export issues. Those can always be a challenge at times. And we also do quite a bit of work to help companies prepare for third-party audits, where outside companies come in and review your HACCP plan, and it has to be in its best shape possible to make sure you do well on those audits. We prefer to help companies when they are wanting to improve. That's the ideal. Sometimes we go in and help companies when something has happened and they're facing significant challenges. For example, a recall or the discovery of a pathogen in their plant, or a regulatory issue where perhaps they're needing expert assistance from the outside to help demonstrate to perhaps USDA or FDA that they're going to correct an issue that may have been found. We always want to help before there's a problem, but if there's a problem, we also do that.
Excellent. You've mentioned a couple of types of audits. I'm going to list them, and maybe you can sort of respond to them. You've already mentioned SQF. I'm going to go through a list, and maybe you can just discuss how HACCP fits into these. BRC, state, local, county agencies. You mentioned GFSI, ISO, Primus, Global Gap, FSSC, FDA, USDA. How do all of those audits or agencies look at a HACCP plan?
It's funny how many acronyms we have in this business. There's quite a few. Let me start with the regulatory side, state, local, county, or federal. Not all businesses must have a HACCP plan at this point. They're mandatory if you process meat or poultry, or if you handle egg products. It's also mandatory for juice and some other specific circumstances, but it's not a regulation for all industries. So it may or may not be part of an inspection, depending on which jurisdiction you fall under, whether it's USDA or FDA. If you don't ship product outside of your own state, you might not be under federal regulations. You might be just under state or local regulations. It's important to find out where you fall when it comes to food and food safety laws. I always begin my HACCP training sessions with a basic understanding of food law, because there's a lot of confusion out there based on the way our country is set up with two different agencies and a combination of federal control versus state control. So we start there. The other acronyms you mentioned, like SQF, BRC, ISO, Primus, and some others, those are acronyms for various types of codes that have been accepted as meeting the Global Food Safety Initiative standards, meaning these various types of audits are accepted and understood by people in 150 countries as being a good audit. So they're very similar because the requirements are similar, and they are very focused on HACCP. These audits, I mentioned earlier that sometimes an audit can only be one day, and it limits an auditor's ability to get their job done. These particular ones you mentioned, like SQF and BRC, are rarely, if ever, only one day. They're much more thorough.
Excellent, Cathy. Your contribution today has been outstanding. I'd like to allow you a couple of minutes to just close your remarks and give your final advice to our food safety audience.
Thank you. The fundamental thing I want to get across is that I'm in this business because I enjoy it and I care about it. There's nothing more important than helping others provide safe food to feed the people in our country and internationally. The best way to do that is to have a strong system in place. I've run across so many companies that grew from a small manufacturer into a larger one, and they are doing their very best. They just weren't aware of the laws or weren't aware of these systems because their company grew in what is typically the American dream, from a small operation to a bigger one because they were working hard. What I help people do is make sure they're doing the right thing and make sure they can prove that they're doing the right thing so they can sustain their business. I absolutely love my work, and I think it's an excellent opportunity to help others, and there will always be a need for food, so it's a great industry to work in.
Well, Cathy, your participation has been most welcome today, and I'd like to extend an invitation in the near future for you to return.
Thank you very much. If you need more information, I'm happy to give my email address. It's Cathy@foodsafety1.com.
Well, Cathy, thank you so much for your time today, and I'd like to wish you a great day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, Andy.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to today's show. Like us on Facebook. Contribute to the AME Food Testing Show with PayPal. Your contributions keep the programming free. Listen to the interviews on your iPhone. Download the free AME Food Testing Show iPhone app. It's easy. Click on the app button, then the news button. Then on each show, click on more, then stream and listen to professional food safety whenever you want.